I started my career coming out of school working at the Department of Defense. And I feel like my perspective from my time in government and the things I learned in school kind of have an interesting intersection in terms of how I now see the world and certain actions in it, particularly as we're at war with Iran. So I made this presentation to share a perspective that I think is not shared widely enough. One that I think is insightful and quite interesting to think about, right? And it tries to answer the question of why America loves dropping bombs. I'm going to start with sharing this chart, right? I don't know if you can see it super clearly there, but hopefully so. This shows the discretionary spending over time and particularly the discretionary spending that goes towards our national defense. Now, the kind of caveat that isn't really a caveat if you think about it that I've mentioned is that I said discretionary spending, right? The biggest thing that we spend money on is actually Social Security, right? That's the biggest kind of category of spending. But we have made the commitments to pay people Social Security payments a long time ago. So when it comes time to set up a new budget for how we're going to spend money, certain money has already been committed, right? We've already signed up to spend it in certain ways. And so the money that we haven't signed up to spend in certain ways is the discretionary spending. And you can look at the chart here and see that there's a bit of up and down over time, but for the most part, it hovers right around here, which is this 50% mark. And what 50% of discretionary spending going to national defense means is that of our money where we can actually choose where it goes, we spend about as much on national defense as everything else put together. Right? And you may be wondering why that is, but this chart is an attempt to show why that is, right? This lists the percent of Americans who say the federal government has a responsibility to provide blank. And the number one thing that Americans say the government has a responsibility to provide is a strong military, right? So, going back to the other chart, why do we spend as much on national defense as everything else put together? Well, it's because Americans feel like that's the number one thing that government should be doing, providing for our national defense. Makes sense, right? Politicians would spend the money in a way that Americans would appreciate and want. This gets me into the next point, though, which is that if you look at this chart, you would be hard pressed without kind of matching it up to presidential timelines to just off the top of your head say, well, which parts were when a Republican was president and which parts were when a Democrat was president, which parts were Republican controlled Congress, which parts were Democratic controlled Congress, which parts were split, where maybe one controlled the House and the other controlled the Senate. If you look at it, you can't really tell just by looking at the chart, right? Maybe if it was that Republicans like defense spending way more, maybe you would see that way higher at times when they had the presidency or were in control of Congress. Or if Democrats like spending on defense more, maybe you would see it in the Democratic cases. But really, both parties do it, right? Both parties spend about as much on defense as everything else put together. Which gets me into the next point. Because both parties spend so much on defense, and that is the number one thing Americans say that government should be doing, it's not really a differentiating factor when it comes time to elections, right? If both the Democrats and the Republicans are going to be spending money on defense, well, then that's not going to really be a reason to choose one over the other, right? So that gets into, well, when it comes time for voters to cast their ballots, what actually is something that differentiates Democrats and Republicans, right? What do voters say is important to them then? And there's been data collected on this, right? This is the result of a poll conducted where they asked people how important are these 22 different items. They asked voters how important are these 22 different items. And voters responded and said that the thing that was extremely important to them more than any other thing was the economy, right? So if you're a politician, you know you got to provide for the national defense, and you know you got to do something about the economy. Well, I mentioned that I started my career in the Department of Defense coming out of school, right? While in school, I picked up a few degrees along the way. One of those degrees was in financial economics, and one idea in economics that I have seen kind of played out across a number of administrations is this idea. It's called the multiplier effect, right? And the theory behind it kind of goes like this. If I spend $1, let's say I go and buy some vegetables, right? The effect of me spending that dollar is more than just $1 in terms of economic activity. And the rationale behind that has to deal with this circular flow of income. The idea is like this. If I spend $1 buying vegetables, that dollar goes toward, let's say, the store that's selling the vegetables. Maybe the store keeps 5% of that dollar in profits, and then 95 cents from that dollar goes to the farmer who sold the vegetables to the store. Well, in producing those vegetables, the farmer had to buy fertilizer and farm equipment and tracking devices to monitor how the vegetables were growing. And so that's all money that the farmer then spent on the fertilizer, on the tracking devices, etc. And so it's not just me spending the dollar once, but it's me spending the dollar. Maybe part of that goes to profit for someone, but then the other part goes to pay for someone else's cost, the farmer's cost. Then it goes to pay for the fertilizer, right? Maybe the farmer keeps some profit for himself, and then let's say another 5 cents, and then 90 cents goes towards the fertilizer and devices and other inputs into producing those vegetables, right? And so it's this idea that $1 spent in the economy ends up having multiple times that $1 in terms of effect on stimulating economic activity. Now, hopefully sounds reasonable. Hopefully I've explained it well enough for you to understand. If not, Google it or ask GPT or whatever else you're going to do. But there are two things that kind of work against this idea, right? One of the two things that works against this idea of the multiplier effect is if I were to spend the dollar, let's say the store owner keeps 5% as profit and then says, you know what, this other 95%, I'm going to put it under my bed and save it for a rainy day, right? If you put it away in savings instead of spending it, it doesn't continue to multiply, right? It kind of gets taken out of that flow of income. The other thing that works against this multiplier effect is if part of the money goes overseas, right? If I spend the dollar and it's I'll say, Japanese company, I don't want to pile on to some country close to Japan that we seem to talk a lot about. But let's say it goes to some Japanese company, right? Well, then the Japanese company is paying the Japanese workers and paying for other things that are not stimulating the US economy in the same way. So, if you were a politician and you wanted to stimulate the economy, you would do things to try and maximize this multiplier effect, right? Be focusing on the domestic economy, right? And trying to encourage people to spend. And if some of that spending, some of that government spending in particular, went to national defense, well, hey, win, 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 win. You get to help strengthen our defense. You get to help stimulate the economy. You get to look good while doing it. Ooh. And that's just what our presidents have done, right? Hey, our boy, the Don, DJT, right? Unleashing American energy, right? Also the Make America Great Again guy with the tariffs, right? Tariffs in particular. Make those foreign goods more expensive. That way the American goods will be cheaper by comparison. With the American goods being cheaper by comparison, we get to stimulate the American economy. Hey. But our boy Big Bold Biden did something similar, right? The Chips and Science Act, right? Instead of us buying chips from overseas, let's make them in America. When we're making them in America, that money that would be going overseas is now spent domestically, stimulating the economy. Hey, Build Back Better Biden, right? Bro Obama did the same thing, though. You remember the cash for clunkers? Hey, if we could make your old car help offset the price of a new one, get you buying a new car, well, that helps stimulate the economy, right? And hey, we got to bail out the banks too. Because if we save the banks, then they'll lend money to people. Then once people have money, they'll go spend it. Once they're spending it, the economy is going to get fired back up. Our boy Goodwill GW. Similar idea with tax cuts and rebate checks, right? If we can keep the government from taking some of your money and keep it in your pocket, well, then you got a little bit more money to spend. If you're out spending a little bit more money, that's going to help stimulate the economy. Once the economy is stimulated, we'll be able to get more in taxes on the back end too, right? Win-win. But even before him, Slick Willie Clinton, right? We need to invest in technology, these industries of the future, right? The new economy. We can invest in these new growing industries, become leaders in those, then we won't be importing them from overseas, right? We'll be producing them domestically. That'll help our economy now and into the future. I could keep going on showing more examples from these presidents I've shown and from the ones before them. But the point I'm trying to make here is that these presidents and politicians understand this. And if they didn't understand it, they have the people around them who do and can influence them, right? They have economic advisors. They have the staffers kind of at their whim, right? Helping to educate them and inform them on important issues. And so they know about this stuff. Now, I know at this point you're probably thinking, well, okay, Jamal, that's all well and good, but I thought you were talking about bombs, right? Well, let's talk about bombs for a little bit. But as we talk about bombs, the first thing I want to highlight here, and this kind of gets to like the crux of this presentation, is what's called the Berry Amendments, right? And these are basically laws that say that if we're spending for the Department of Defense, then what we spend on needs to be produced domestically, right? We got to be buying American. When these amendments kind of first started, their first iteration, it was things like textiles, right? Like clothing and cloth, right? So kind of uniforms for the soldiers. But over time, it expanded to more complex and costly things like specialty metals that may be used in, you guessed it, missiles and bombs, aircraft and ships and planes and things like that. So that's kind of the connection that I want to highlight here, is that this defense spending is also stimulating the domestic economy. And because it stimulates the domestic economy, it helps politicians get to the thing that voters care about, the economy, and helps them get at the thing that Americans care about, our national defense, right? Win-win. Creates a special incentive for them to keep spending on defense. And in particular, what I'm going to highlight here next is politicians know this. Back to our boy, Mr. Trump, President Trump. The Iran war, right? And before the Iran war, we had the missile strikes in Iran, taking out their nuclear capabilities, at least for some time, right? Trump wasn't the only one, though. Biden selling missiles and armaments to Ukraine. If we sell some of our stockpile to another country, well, naturally, we have to replenish. When we replenish, we gotta buy more, right? Biden wasn't the only one either, though. You remember Obama with the drone strikes, don't you? Firing off the missiles in Libya and against ISIS, right? And of course, before Obama, we had G.W. Bush with the Afghanistan and Iraq wars. That lasted for many, many years. But also, again, before Bush, we had President Clinton with strikes in Serbia and Kosovo, right? Was it Operation Allied Force? So my point is that there are strong incentives for our presidents and politicians to use airstrikes, to drop bombs, to set off some missiles, go pew, 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 pew. And when we do that, when we detonate a bomb that can only be used once, we got to buy another one, because if we don't, we're left in a worse position. If we're left in a worse position, then our national defense is jeopardized. And both sides of the aisle agree that we can't have that. Americans don't want that. So there's a special incentive for us to keep dropping bombs, which kind of gets me to the last point I'm going to make. And I feel like this is like the really relevant one. I'm sharing this not so much to provide commentary or good or bad on the presidents that I've highlighted here, on the political parties that they represented, but more so to say, I understand that a lot of people would like our government to be better. And I think one of the first steps in working towards a better government is to deeply and empathetically understand why our government is the way it is right now. So I'm sharing this to kind of provide insight into that from my time with the Department of Defense, where I worked in logistics, helping to make sure that we had the supply so that we would be ready in case stuff started popping off. And also from my time in school, where I studied economics and learned about activities that we could partake in, policies that we could enact to help our economy grow. Right? I'm not the only one that understands these things. Many people do, and they put it to effect, as I've shown in this presentation. The real question then is, what could be a better solution? Right? I think the answer that we can throw out is, well, let's just cut back on the defense spending, right? It's clear that Americans don't want that. It's also clear that Americans like the defense spending being spent on buying American products, right? We don't want to be buying the military equipment, right? The latest and greatest jets from somewhere else, because if they're coming from somewhere else, then we aren't the leading military anymore. People don't want that either. So, how could things be different? I have a few ideas that I'm keeping in my pocket, which is why you should subscribe, because I'll be talking about those ideas more in videos upcoming. But I am someone who believes that good ideas can come from anywhere. So I encourage you to leave your ideas in the comments and help contribute to a more lively discussion, right? A more informed debate, if it even gets to the point of a debate, right? But just the more options, the better, right? If you got ideas, share them. I'll share mine too. I hope you subscribe. I thank you for watching, and I wish you well. Take care.